It's a bit strange to be doing this virtually, but it's kind of nice speaking from the comfort of my home. You can't see whether I've got on nice trousers or maybe a pair of jeans or perhaps even pajama bottoms. Of course, the main reason for this meeting is that FOI Oklahoma is giving out awards tonight for some very well deserving recipients. So I think it's appropriate if I use my time to give a shout out and a hearty verbal and virtual pat on the back to the journalists and perhaps some lawyers who represent them, like the late David McCullough, for the work they do, keeping us all informed about this strange life we're living in 2020. It's really to those professional journalists out there that I am speaking tonight, and here and there sharing some personal musings about the work that the media are doing these days. 2020 is no doubt a year we'd like to forget. The cover on the most recent issue of Time magazine is simple. It's the number 2020 with a big red X over it and the subtitle, The Worst Year Ever. And in this environment, dominated by politics, police, protesters, and pandemic, journalists have had to face extraordinary challenges in gathering news, ferreting out the facts, holding public officials and agencies accountable, and all the while trying to stay safe and healthy. Now, I've never been a journalist. I've never had to walk in the shoes of a reporter or editor or do a live stand up in front of a camera or sit at an anchor desk or burn the midnight oil poring over mundane documents looking for a key fact to explain what some politician has been up to. Nevertheless, I have a sense that even in the best of times, being a professional journalist isn't easy, putting aside the issue of pay. And in times like the year 2020, the challenges are enormous. Now, politicians have always been suspicious of journalists. They're always snooping around, looking for dirt, wanting to expose wrongdoing, and in the politicians' eyes, jumping to unfounded conclusions and thinking that every politician must be up to something nefarious. Even among the general public, which has little understanding of the role of the journalist or the professional standards to which most journalists adhere, people tend to be a little distrusting of the job you're doing. But in 2020, perhaps built on a foundation laid in 2016, the challenges have been unprecedented. You're called the enemy of the people and accused of publishing and broadcasting fake news. The deep political, social, racial, religious, and class division in the country have never been more stark. And they enhance the difficulties journalists face in presenting an accurate picture of what is happening in the world. If you're not in the same echo chamber as the reader or listener, it doesn't matter what you say or how well sourced it is or how truthful your reporting might be, you're not believed. And the reporting you've done as a result of a lot of hard work is ignored, or even worse, castigated on social media or made the subject of litigation. Yet the journalists I know and read and watch and admire continue to do that hard work despite the obstacles. Some of those obstacles can be downright scary, even life-threatening. Let me give you some examples that you're all familiar with. After the deaths of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd at the hands of police, protesters took to the streets in large numbers all over the country, including here in Oklahoma City. Protests, mostly peaceful ones, went on day after day, week after week. Police responded, sometimes calmly and patiently, protecting, or at least not interfering, with the rights of protesters to give voice to their concerns. Sometimes, however, the response was with shields and rubber bullets and tear gas. Reporters, even those wearing clear identification as members of the media, were pushed back from public places where they had a right to be. They were tear gassed or struck with pellets or rubber bullets, and in some instances arrested unlawfully despite showing their credentials. In some cities, armed militants roamed the streets, and no media credentials would be enough to protect a journalist if someone chose to fire a weapon. The response of governors, mayors, and other public officials, as well as the police, to the protests did not always give due respect to the First Amendment or recognize the importance of the journalist's obligations to report accurately what was happening. A lot of cities, including Oklahoma City, imposed curfews and created safe zones, oftentimes around public buildings to which protesters were not permitted to go. At first, some of the emergency orders directed at protesters didn't give adequate deference to the role of journalists. They were not treated as an essential service, exempt from the restrictions. But in most instances, usually as a result of the work of First Amendment lawyers together with the journalists, if journalists were omitted from the definition of essential service to begin with, the definition was changed to include them so they could be free to report what was happening in the streets. That's what happened here in Oklahoma City when Mayor Holt initially imposed a curfew and restricted access to municipal buildings. Journalists were not exempted from the restrictions. A few phone calls from the media and council, and that changed. And the emergency order was rescinded within a day or two. Anyway, so the matter became moot here. My understanding is that curfew restrictions were much more rigid in other cities. But generally, with the aid of organizations like the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, the restrictions were challenged and lifted for journalists. Yet, for a day here, a couple of days there, journalists' First Amendment rights were violated and they were prohibited from effectively doing their job. In any event, emergency orders or no, journalists were on the streets, sometimes at risk of their personal safety, reporting about the protests and the response of law enforcement, or the reaction of citizens who were opposed to the protesters, or about vandals who were breaking windows and looting stores while law enforcement was distracted by the protests. I think overall the reporting was pretty incredible. I think we got a pretty accurate picture of what was behind the protests, the moral energy that invigorated the protesters, and the political fallout the protests created. The politics of 2020 created enormous obstacles for journalists in many different ways, and those were exponentially complicated because it was a presidential election year. In a larger sense, reporting accurately was especially complex this year because it was not always easy to decipher what is the fact or what is the truth. And when you have politicians from the president on down who sometimes have difficulty distinguishing fact from fiction, how do you report what they say and do? If President Trump, for example, says something in a tweet or in a press conference that is totally absurd or something known to be totally false, like Trump's claim that he won the 2020 election, how do you report that? Is it newsworthy simply because he said it? And you should report the fact that he said it, regardless of its absurdity? Or do you ignore it and let Fox News and OAN report it? Or what if the president or a doctor put out there by the president as a medical expert recommend using hydroxychloroquine to treat COVID-19? How do you report that? Does transparency of government action require you to repeat what the president said without qualification? Or do you report what he said and also report conflicting medical viewpoints, leaving the reader or viewer to sort out the truth for themselves? Or do you make an affirmative statement about what the majority of medical experts believe is the truth, despite the president's proclamation? As a First Amendment lawyer, I can find a defense for whatever approach you take in reporting public statements of questionable accuracy, but I don't envy your having to make the editorial choice. Since the election last month, the media have been faced with the dilemma of accurately reporting the outcome. Now, it's easy to recite the vote count as reported by local election officials. On election night and for days after, you could readily depend on Steve Kornacki and his big board on MSNBC to give you the latest numbers and a detailed analysis. And current vote totals were easily found on hundreds of websites and social media platforms. But what do you make of the claims of the president and his allies that the election was rigged or that there was massive voter fraud? How much of those claims do you report and how do you put the facts in context? The reporting task has become a little easier, perhaps, as secretaries of state and other state and local election officials, many of them Republicans, as well as the FBI and cybersecurity officials in the Trump administration, have said that the election involved no discernible fraud or outside interference that affected the outcome. I've personally been pleased to see media accounts of Trump's election fraud claims preface virtually any reference to such claims with words like false or baseless. Yet we know from those same media accounts or any casual review of social media that there are thousands of people who believe that Biden won because of voter fraud. How do you cover this election dispute and accurately report the facts? I think this is more a journalism ethics issue than any legal one, but it's a troubling challenge to their reporters and their editors and producers. And how do you report that there are some believers in voter fraud and rigged elections who've taken to social media or even to the streets to threaten and harass election officials or those who counted votes or certified the results? Do you report the threats and repeat the threatening words because you can actually do so as a fact? Or does the reporting in some way encourage other believers to continue the threats and harassment? How does a journalist respond to hateful comments on Facebook or Twitter directed at them, often reciting falsehoods as if they were facts, attacking the reporter for telling it like it is? Now, overlaying all these normal news gathering and reporting challenges faced by journalists today is the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. In the grand scheme of things, COVID has dominated the news all year long. It is, of course, the single largest news event, aside from the election, that has commanded the attention of the media all year. Not surprisingly, COVID and the election reporting have displaced much of what would normally be on the front page of the newspaper or take up the first few minutes of a television news program. Such things as international politics. When was the last time something about North Korea was the lead story? Or on a national level, the border wall, separation of immigrant families seeking asylum in DACA, or natural disasters such as wildfires or an extraordinary hurricane season. They've all taken a backseat to COVID and the election. Even locally, other than the regular breaking news reporting of crimes and accidents, much of the reporting is COVID related. The number of people infected or hospitalized or dead is on the front page of the paper every day or in the first block of every TV news show. Not a lot of space or time is allocated to state budget issues, pending or anticipated legislation, education funding problems, other than reporting about Epic Charter Schools, the well-deserved recipient of the Black Hole Award. Most reporting about education has to do with COVID-driven hard choices of school administrators between virtual and in-person learning. Local political reporting tends to deal with decisions by public officials at the state and local level about whether to mandate the use of masks or to impose curfews on certain kinds of businesses and the impact those decisions have on citizens, business owners, and local revenues. Now, perhaps the ebb and flow of what is news in 2020 is not so unusual. What commands the attention of the media and readers and viewers is simply a function of what commands the attention of the media and readers and viewers at any particular moment in time. But there can be no doubt that COVID-19 has severely impacted the ability of journalists to gather the news that they feel they should report. As members of FOI Oklahoma know well, public officials and agencies have, in what you might call ordinary times, been resistant to providing information and being accessible to journalists despite open meetings and open records laws. COVID has certainly aided or exacerbated that resistance. When the pandemic first arrived, one of the first reactions of public officials was to impose shelter-in-place orders. Although journalists were generally exempt from those orders, their work was considered necessary or essential, and they could try to gather the news and report what was happening in the community. The sources of information became more difficult to find. Courthouses and public agencies closed their doors. Government activities and proceedings were postponed. Government officials and employees weren't to be found in their offices. No one was around to provide a public record unless it was available electronically. Eventually, government agencies found ways to conduct business virtually, and generally speaking, I think the media have been able to cover public meetings online, but it's required an adjustment on everyone's part to do so. I do think conducting government meetings virtually has reduced the personal element of reporting, the ability of a journalist to get a full sense of the feel of a meeting, or to be able to pull an official aside afterwards for a comment. My sense is that COVID's greatest impact, at least from the logistical standpoint, has been on getting access to documents. If records are maintained only on hard copies and aren't scanned promptly and stored digitally, you have to find a person who will find and copy the record for you. And if the government office is closed or minimally staffed, the response time to an open records request becomes even greater than normal. I suspect records access in metropolitan counties is still relatively prompt, despite COVID, but I wonder what it's like getting public records in rural Oklahoma. I haven't had any need to make an open records request outside of Oklahoma County this year, and my media clients haven't come to me with any unusual problems in rural Oklahoma. So I really don't know what logistical obstacles are thrown in the way of getting access to documents outside the metro. COVID has not only created logistical problems in getting access to public records, it has become an excuse for some officials and agencies to try to limit or deny access. My recollection is that in the early days of the pandemic, the state health department was terribly inept at providing reliable numbers of infections, hospitalizations, and COVID related deaths. I think that after a time, the health department may have gotten its act together a little and made those numbers more reliable and more available. But early on, there was still resistance to providing COVID related information. The Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, HIPAA, was cited improperly as a ground not to provide COVID numbers. If you recall, in June, the state health department took down the data dashboard it created in April. It gave fairly detailed local information about the spread of the virus. It cited state and federal privacy laws as prohibiting the disclosure of the information in the absence of a health emergency declaration from the governor. Fortunately, a couple of days later, the AG ruled that personal information could be released. But the fact that HIPAA and other privacy laws were cited as an excuse not to provide public data is troubling. And even when COVID numbers are released by the state health department, questions remain about reliability. There was an article just this week in the Bartlesville Examiner Enterprise. It reported that local health officials said that a confidential report on the number of active COVID cases they receive from OSDH was consistently 4 to 5 times lower than what the health department was showing on its public website. What's a reporter to do when trying accurately to report the number of cases in a given locality when the official source of the numbers is putting out conflicting data? I'll leave it to Paul and Whitney and Cassie to explain it to you. And congratulations, by the way, to them for earning the Ben Blackstock Award. Their work for Oklahoma Watch and the Frontier has been awesome. COVID, of course, presents more than just practical obstacles to getting access to public officials, agencies, meetings, and records. The health and safety of journalists has been placed at risk by the virus. The virus does not respect gender or age or occupation. Journalists are just as much at risk in getting infected as anyone else whose job it is to be out in the public. Reporters at both national and local levels seem to be diligent in wearing masks and maintaining social distance in doing their reporting, though it is a bit strange seeing a TV reporter with a boom mic standing 6 feet away from a person they're interviewing and struggling to understand one another through their masks. But what is the normal work environment is different this year because of COVID. Early in the pandemic, newsrooms, like many businesses, shut down, sending all but the most essential staff home to work remotely. And those that had to remain in the shop often did so on a rotating basis. Newsrooms have started to open back up, but in shops I'm familiar with, masks are still required most of the time. Social distancing is the rule, and the normal collegiality of the newsroom is missing. Reporters are still on the streets gathering the news and sometimes the virus. Pointer keeps a running list of journalists who have died from COVID-19. As of September 29, there were at least 122 foreign journalists and 17 U.S. journalists who succumbed to the virus. Not all of those were active journalists who were infected while reporting, but some were. And there are numerous instances of American journalists who were infected and have recovered. High-profile ones such as Leslie Stahl, Chris Cuomo, George Stephanopoulos, Stephanie Ruhle, among others, and an untold number of less known journalists, many of whom may have been infected but show no symptoms of the virus. It just goes without saying that journalists often need to be in public and may have to travel to do their jobs, no matter how careful they may be, no matter what precautions like masking are taken, the risk of exposure is there. But to their credit, the journalists I know go about their job in gathering the news and reporting what is going on in this crazy COVID world of 2020. I applaud them for their determination and diligence, even courage, in keeping us informed, despite the extraordinary challenges this year has brought. And I applaud FOI Oklahoma for recognizing those who have worked hard to bring us the information we need, despite politics, police, protesters, and the pandemic. Thanks for letting me talk to you tonight. Andy, Mike, back to you.